advisory counselor for the whole of ISKCON, for GBC of ISKCON. Chaitanya Charan Prabhu has been practicing bhakti for many years now. He is a mentor, monk, speaker. He is an author for 25 books on applied mindfulness and purpose for living. His daily articles on Gita Daily keeps coming, and he has given 4,000 inspirational meditations on Bhagavad Gita till now. He is an invited guest for TEDx, World Peace Conference, UNESCO, Intel, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, Stanford, Princeton University, Yale University, Harvard University, MIT, and Cambridge, and whatnot. And Prabhuji gives 400. He has given already 400 talks across 100 cities in 4 continents every year. Not just till now, every year. Also, he is a spiritual consultant in Bhaktivedanta Hospital at Mumbai, and he is the member of SAC, that is known as Shastric Advisory Council. This is the world's topmost intellectual body in ISKCON that we have, and Prabhuji is a member of that. So actually, he was the first member of an Indian origin, as far as I know. So we are very fortunate to have Prabhuji's association with us, and let us try to understand his deep insights on the subject of science and spirituality. And also, after Prabhuji presents his talk, maybe for about 1 hour or so from now, after that we will open up for questions. So all the students, those who have questions, you can put that, you can choose to raise your hands and ask yourself if you can put your video on, or otherwise you can put it on the chat box for me to ask on behalf of you. Okay, so Prabhuji, handing it over to you. You can kindly begin.
Hare Krishna. I hope I'm audible to everyone. I'm grateful to be here with all of you today. I'll begin with some prayers. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanishalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Desha Tarine Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So grateful to be here with all of you today. And today we'll discuss on the topic of science and scripture, how to harmonize them together. So I'll take this in 3 broad parts. I'll be sharing a PowerPoint where I'll explain certain things, and we will have abundant time for question answers later. So if you consider this is a broad framework. Now when we look at scriptural wisdom, some of scriptural knowledge may agree with science, some may disagree with science, and some may transcend science. So now, although I have drawn this in such a way that these 3 seem to be equivalent, or for some people, what contradicts science may seem to be very large. But actually, if we study this, it depends on where we are coming from and how we perceive things. So for some people, this 3rd section of what contradicts, this section of what where scripture contradicts science may seem to be very large. But as we grow spiritually and we mature in our understanding, we will recognize that actually that section, it will diminish, and the section that transcends science will become what matters most to us. So let's look at how this will work. So now when I talk about agreeing with science or contradicting science or transcending science, what exactly are we referring to? So firstly, when we talk about science and we talk about scripture, and then we talk about their discourse, their interaction, their dialogue, which may be confrontational at times. First of all, how do we define science? How do we define scripture? How do we define a contradiction? These themselves are very complex subjects. The science, although it's a word which is very widely used, science itself doesn't have a very universally agreed definition. Some of the most prominent scientists, like say the pioneering scientists, Newton, Galileo, and others, they did not call themselves the scientists. The word scientist itself came in the late 19th century, in the 18th, 19th centuries, and it was in the late 19th century that it started gaining circulation. So, so Newton called himself as a natural philosopher. That means they observe nature and try to philosophize about what they observe in nature. That's the idea of natural philosophy. So much of what was considered science at the time of Newton is today not considered science. Much was not considered science is considered science today. So these definitions themselves are very porous, and we need to keep that in mind before arriving at any radical declarations that this contradicts science or this doesn't contradict science. This is that A is scientific and B is unscientific. So first of all, why does it matter for us? It matters because there are some things in scripture which seem to raise serious questions. So I'll approach this first from the perspective of science, and then we look at it from the perspective of specific points which may seem to contradict. So let's look at it. So when there is a contradiction, we could consider broadly three possibilities: that science could be wrong, science could be incomplete, and science and scripture could observe from different scales. So now, what do I mean by science is wrong? Much of the history of science is laid with the debris of theories that were considered uh, almost bedrock science. Later on, were shown to be, hey, they're not that true. So, for example, more than if you went back to about a decade, about a century ago, the mainstream idea that was there about the universe, especially in the scientific community, was that the universe has a steady state. So this was that the universe is the way it has existed now. That's how it is forever. That is how it has been forever. Now the steady state theory was propagated and accepted in some ways to avoid confronting the big questions. So generally, whenever we are having a discussion, one of the principles for having a reasonable discussion is not just to say this is right and this is wrong. First, to show, okay, this is what I am seeing. Okay, and this is what you are seeing. So why do the two things agree or disagree? But it's not just enough to say this. It's also important to say, where am I standing when I'm seeing this? And why am I standing there? So imagine a huge mountain peak. So some people might be approaching the mountain peak from one side, some people might be approaching the mountain peak from another side. The two may say very different things. But the key thing is that although they're seeing the same reality, they're saying it differently. And where the three things: what one is seeing, where one is standing, and why one is standing there. If these three things are understood, then there is a possibility for serious discussion where it is not that one person is simply trying to prove the other person wrong. So what happens is science itself is, while it talks about the nature of nature, it also is contextual. So certain theories which were considered right at one time, later on they turn out to be, they are rejected by the mainstream community. So we could go into many theories like this, but the point here is not to criticize science, it is only to contextualize science. The very idea of progress means that what was known in the past, we need to revise it, we need to improve it, we need to refine it. So then the second is science is incomplete. Now, why might science be incomplete? There could be specific theories which could be incomplete, like say the Big Bang theory. Now, the Big Bang theory of cosmic origins, it is one theory, and it has been developed and revised and reworded in many different ways, reimagined in various ways. But the Big Bang theory still leaves two important questions unanswered. Whatever existed in the beginning that exploded, where did that come from and what caused it to explode? So to understand why this question is important, let's consider, say, an India-Pakistan cricket match is going on. And then the last ball, India needs a sixer to win the match. And the ball comes and it's a short pitch ball and the batsman hits, maybe it's Virat Kohli who hits the ball for a straight six. And then the whole country celebrates. And then after that post-match, there is an interview. And somebody asks, so how did you hit that sixer? And say the Indian captain says, it was by Newton's laws of motion. Really? By Newton's laws of motion? What do you mean by that? So obviously we could calculate by Newton's laws of motion, okay, the ball came at this speed, it was hit at this speed, and this was the way it made contact with the bat. If it had made contact not in the center but either in the top or the top edge or the bottom edge, then it wouldn't have gone across the boundary. So we could use the Newton's laws of motion to explain why the ball went across the boundary. Now that is one explanation, and that is a valid explanation. But is it the most valuable explanation? Is it the most relevant explanation at that point? Well, not really. Newton's laws of motion can't explain the skill of the batsman. It can't explain the precise hand to feet coordination, the sharp vision, the presence of mind, all that goes on into making a great batsman. So the point I'm making here is that just as for the ball going across the boundary, it could be explained in terms of Newton's laws of motion. And that just because of explanation is valid doesn't make it valuable. Just because something is correct doesn't make it complete. So science offers explanations and they are correct, but they may not be complete because certain parameters are left out of the explanation. So as the third we'll discuss each of these points more in detail as we move forward. The third possibility could be that things are different because they are being observed from different scales of observation. That there are different levels to reality and the same thing can be observed from different levels. So let's look at these one by one. So now when we talk about reality, what exactly do we mean by reality and how does it work? So what happens is whenever there is data, science is concerned with observation. The observation is you can have 3 straight points. Now based on those 3 points, you could draw a straight line, we could draw a hyperbola, we could draw a circle, we could draw a parabola, we could draw so many, we could draw an arc. So which set of which kind of graph we draw based on the data, that can vary very much. So similarly, what science gives us essentially is observations. and based on those observations, certain conceptions are arrived at, or sometimes the conceptions come first and the observations confirm or disprove those conceptions. But the point is, even if the observations are valid, they could be interpreted in different ways. And that's why the idea that scientific knowledge could be incorrect or incomplete, this is not a criticism of science. This is just a historically contextualized cognition of how science works. Now, when we say science, is there something beyond science? When I say science is incomplete, just like the batsman's expertise, we could measure the speed with which a bowler bowls a ball. We could measure how far the sixer goes outside the stadium. But can we quantify the skill of the batsman? We have various systems of rating players, who is the top player for this year, who is top batsman, top bowler. But that is about their performance. Can we rate talent itself? Can we rate caliber itself? Not necessarily. It's very difficult. If we consider the world of science and reality, so we can say what science studies is like this small yellow part below, and there is a much bigger reality that science doesn't study. Now, again, when I say science doesn't study something, the point here is again not to criticize, it is to contextualize. You see, reality around us is extremely complicated. If I just take this small glass, now I could do a PhD thesis on a glass itself. Now, what is the ideal size of the glass? What is the ideal weight? What is the ideal material? And when you talk about ideal, for whom is it ideal? Maybe for a baby, for a small child below 10, something else is ideal. For an athletic youth, something else is ideal. For a adult, something else is ideal. For a aged person, something else might be ideal. So something as simple as a glass can become almost unlimitedly complicated when we start studying it deeply. So what happens whenever we study a subject, we tend to focus. We tend to focus on certain parameters. So is this a good glass? Well, it depends on what my purpose is. If my purpose is to maybe increase my fluid intake because I drink less water, then maybe having a larger glass helps. If so, science, when it began its study, right from the time of Galileo and others, science divided nature into two parameters, or two, we could say two properties. What it called as primary properties and what it called as secondary properties. So primary properties, according to science, are those that are measurable, those that are quantifiable. And then science had phenomenal success in relating these parameters through mathematical equations. And that's how all our technology has developed. At the same time, when focus goes on one thing, focus goes off other things. So the secondary parameters, such as, say, what are secondary parameters? When we eat food, at one level we are concerned, okay, how much calories is this particular thing that I'm taking? If we're diet conscious, we might be conscious of that. But that's not the primary thing we are concerned about. When we want to eat food, we want to know how tasty it is. We want to know how overall healthy it is. So now if we want to know how tasty it is, we can't have a tastometer to tell how tasty it is. Taste is a very real experience for us, yet taste itself is not mathematically measurable. The composition, the ingredients can be scientifically analyzed, can be scientifically measured, but taste is something higher. There is a whole subject in the philosophy of science called qualia. Qualia is the properties that we experience in nature. What are they? So if we consider medical science, one of its primary purposes is to free people from disease and pain. And despite all our best advances in science, and the advances are often impressive, through medical science now we can know what is going on even in the smallest cell in the most unreachable part of the human body. And yet through it all, we can't, through all those instruments, we can't actually measure pain. We can't quantify how much pain are you in. Well, you can't really say that. While pain is a very real experience, it's not a mathematically quantifiable experience. So why are we talking about this? The point here is to contextualize science. That science focuses on talking about the measurable properties within nature and their mutual interactions. And while it has been phenomenally successful in that, there are things which are left out within this scientific worldview. And some of the things that are left out in such a worldview are what we talked about just now, are also important in our lived experience. So unless we recognize that there is something higher that we all live for, that there are other things that matter for us, without that understanding, our own understanding of reality will be fragmented. So now what I'm saying is not just something which I am saying because I'm a spiritualist. I was trained in science and engineering, and this is a point which also thoughtful scientists have recognized. So this is Nobel laureate Schrodinger, Erwin Schrodinger, saying this. So I am amazed. I am very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives a lot of factual information, puts all our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart, that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in those domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. So this is a scientist, not just an ordinary scientist. This is a very prominent scientist speaking this. And why is he speaking this? Not to criticize science, but to contextualize science. Science is a very powerful tool for acquiring knowledge, and every tool has its purpose. So he's recognizing what is the purpose of this tool. It gives us two things: factual information, and it puts all our experiences in a magnificently consistent order. Magnificently consistent order means that it enables us to to say, if we are flying from, say, Mumbai to New York, then which flight will reach there in how much time, where it will be at a particular time, how, based on the speed of the airplane, based on the speed of the winds. All this can be uh, predicted with a significant amount of accuracy, and that's very helpful in planning things and executing things. So in that sense, it puts it in a very consistent order. The factual information is put in consistent order. So science, you remember I talked about the first circle, that there is something which agrees with science, something which contradicts science, and something which transcends science. So if we consider our lived reality, we all use science, definitely, no doubt. At the same time, we all live with things much more than what science talks about. What do I mean by that? A couple of years when I was in America, a seminar in a university, a multi-part seminar on overcoming fear. So there, we're discussing how people's fears change over time. So what were the top 10 fears in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century? Now, as far as sociological data goes, we can find that out. So in the 21st century, two new fears have come in among the top 10. One is the fear of terrorists, and the second is the fear of rejection. Rejection means that when people want to form some relationships, whether it is India or the rest of the world, in the past, most relationships, most marriages were formed with some kind of arrangement. and there is a sense of commitment and irreversibility to the idea of marriage. But today it is not there. So whenever people form a relationship, there is a great fear that I may be rejected. Either I may be rejected and the relationship itself may not form, or the relationship may start, but just before it can arrive at the level of commitment, it may be rejected. I may be rejected. Or sometimes it may be that after decades of being together, I may be rejected. So it's a great fear. And whenever people want to form a relationship, they would like to know, does this other person really care for me, or do they care only for my looks or for my bank account? Now with all our scientific advancement, we cannot develop a lovometer. Say if a boy proposes to a girl, I love you, will you please marry me? And the girl says, okay, let me take out a lovometer, place it on your heart and see, do you really care for me? Well, we can't do that. Although love is a real experience and we really long to experience it, it is again not mathematically quantifiable. So even if, say, somebody lets us down, somebody disappoints us, somebody betrays us, again, how do you quantify betrayal? We can't. So the point is that although science and its product technology have radically reformulated, reshaped the world we live in, still there is much in our life that cannot be reduced to science. And that is not the deficiency of, that is not that is again not to criticize science, that is again to remind that it is not that life is to be reduced to science, rather science is to be placed within our life. Science exists because we exist. We as thinking humans, we have developed science. So in a sense, this is just, if we contextualize things, there will be things which transcend science, and that sector of transcend science, that is where we focus in spirituality. So science, we could say, is the study of matter. Spirituality is the study of what matters. What matters? What is really important in life? What will make my life meaningful? What will bring fulfillment in my life? Now, what is it that I need to choose, and what do I need to not do? There's very important decisions in our life, and we cannot do them simply based on science alone. Science can be one valuable source of guidance, but at the same time, we all, what really matters for us? So science cannot tell what really matters for us. And what really matters, the analysis of that, the study of that, is spirituality. So which among our various relationships, which relationships are most important for us? Among our various values, what values are the most important for us? Among our various goals or purposes in life, which are the most important for us? Can they be placed in a hierarchy? How do we place them in a hierarchy? All this is the domain of spirituality. So if we study scripture, whether we study the Bhagavad Gita or we study the Srimad Bhagavatam, these are all focusing on what matters. Arjuna, when he has to face a fratricidal war, at that time he starts thinking, what matters really for me? Is it winning the kingdom, or is it protecting my dynasty? Then he realizes it's not that simple. That actually, it's not just my dynasty is there on the other side. My family is also there on this side. And it's not simply winning the kingdom. It's also ensuring that those who are vicious don't gain power. So what really matters? So the Bhagavad Gita, or the Mahabharata, if you consider it large, the Mahabharata talks about advanced technology in the sense of some very sophisticated weapons which are used at that time. But they are analyzing and discussing them is not the thrust of the Mahabharata. That is definitely not the thrust of the Bhagavad Gita. The thrust of the Bhagavad Gita is, okay, pruchhami tvam dharma sammudha chetaha what is dharma? What am I meant to do? What is the right thing for me to do? Dharma essentially, dharma can have many meanings, but it is in the context of Arjuna, what is the right thing to do for me? So that is what the Bhagavad Gita discusses. So spirituality is the study of what matters. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, Parikshit Maharaj is cursed to die in 7 days. At that time, the questions come up. Okay, what should a person do when they are about to die? So as even today, that question remains. If somebody gets a terminal diagnosis of cancer, then often there are issues of quality of life. And nowadays, in end of life care, in hospice care, spiritual health is considered almost of supreme importance, because once a person is diagnosed that they're going to die, and mainstream science doesn't have much to offer to help them except in palliative care to help them to manage the pain, then what does the person want to do? Maybe they have 3 months to live, 6 months to live. What do they want to do? That is where a chaplain comes in, or some end of life care consultant comes in, and people do want to do something that is spiritually meaningful for them. And that's the discussion of the Bhagavad Gita, of the Srimad Bhagavatam. So the study of matter versus the study of what matters. So when we study scripture, when we study books like the Bhagavad Gita or the Srimad Bhagavatam, the third sector, that which transcends science, that is what is the primary thrust. And with that thrust in mind, whatever is not that, we focus on that when we are studying scripture. And to go toward that sector, those sections which agree with science, we can use them as initial takeoff points. They may trigger our interest, they may help us gain some credibility, they may help us nurture our faith, but ultimately it is the section that transcends scripture, that guides us how we can live. That's what matters. And then the quadrant where science and scripture contradict each other, how do we deal with that? Yes, there are different ways to deal with that, and I will take one example to deal with that right now, and then we will move on to question answers. So till now I talked about the interaction of science and spirituality, and I focused on how there is a domain beyond science and that matters for us, and that is what spirituality and the spiritual texts primarily discuss. So let's look at something over here. So one of the more disturbing aspects of scripture is its cosmology. So the Bhagavad Puran, for example, describes a cosmology that seems to be quite strange, and some people might say unbelievable. And Srila Prabhupada has also made certain statements about the moon, which can seem very provocative. So we could say, did man go to the moon or not? Isn't this a place where science and scripture contradict? Not exactly. Why is that? Because if we consider what Srila Prabhupada was primarily saying, his point was that the moon is a different moon exists at a different level of reality. And those without the proper qualification cannot enter there. Just like now, if somebody wants to go to America, they need to go through the proper immigration channels. They need to get the visa, and they can enter into America after that. Now, some people, a large number of people, can break through the immigration system, and especially through from Southern America, from Mexico and others. A lot of immigrants go in there. That's true, but that's because it's a more human system which is fallible. But those systems which are governed by higher beings, they're not that fallible. So the point was not that we can't go to the moon. The point was that there is a different vision of the moon. The moon is not just seen as another object of the many objects that are existing in space, which are just filled with empty space. The moon is seen as a higher planet. So why would somebody see like that? What is the point over there? So here we talk about perspectives. So scale of observation. If you consider, say, this is chalk powder and this is coke powder. We take, now if you mix both of them together, we'll get gray powder. Now, if you look at this gray powder under a microscope, what will you see? You won't see any gray powder. You will see actually white particles and black particles. So what is it actually? Is it white particles and black particles, or is it a gray powder? Well, it depends on the scale of observation. It depends on what scale we are observing it. So even if sometimes there are some videos on YouTube which show about how even the most captivating face, most beautiful face, if it is seen under a microscope, it appears to be filled with valleys and mountains and peaks and all kinds of undulating surfaces. What looks very smooth and shiny to our normal eyes doesn't look that way under a microscope. So the scale of observation changes perception substantially. So the point of the Bhagavatam, if we consider, what is the point of the Bhagavatam? The Bhagavatam is not being spoken to give Parikshit Maharaj a PhD in cosmology. That is not the interest of Parikshit Maharaj also. Parikshit Maharaj's interest is, okay, I'm going to die soon and I want to fix my mind on transcendence. I want to fix my mind on Krishna. And for that purpose, what do? What is done? Shukdev Goswami gives him a vision of things where how everything, how there is latent spirituality everywhere. That is what is being shown. So I was in America and I met, actually I was in Canada, and I met a devotee over there whose friend is a property developer. And this friend from America, he's basically a golf course developer. He makes golf. So he came from Canada to Vrindavan to, because there was apparently the government over there wanted to develop golf courses, and he came to Vrindavan to present a tender, to look at the property and to give his proposal and everything like that. So he came to Vrindavan. He went to Govardhan because Govardhan is the sacred mountain associated with Krishna Lila, and he went there, but he didn't visit a single temple over there. His interest, although he came to the most sacred of places in the world, his interest was totally commercial, it was not spiritual. And all that he saw there, okay, this land is good, this land is not so good, here we need to flatten the mountain over here we have to do this, we'll have to do that. So what happens is our intention determines our vision. Now so there were many things, there are many other things, many spiritual things in Vrindavan to see, but he didn't see them. He didn't seek them, he didn't see them. Now, if you go back to my earlier point of when science focuses on primary properties, not secondary properties, or what science considers secondary properties. So take that further, and we look at the Bhagavatam and we look at science. So science, even when scientists, space scientists want to study the moon, they are approaching it from the perspective of maybe another place to stay, another place to mine some minerals, another place to, say, plant the flag of the earth. So it is primarily seen with a particular perspective. So whereas spirituality talks of things from a different perspective. So now what is the reality? Both realities could coexist because they are at different scales of perception. So at a physical level, It may be possible that somebody might go to the moon and come back. It may not be, we don't know. But the point is, when Prabhupada talks about the moon mission, his focus is that if we want to experience the moon at a higher level, we need to expand our consciousness to that higher level. We need to, without expanding that consciousness to a higher level, without gaining the appropriate qualifications in terms of karma that lead to the expansion of consciousness, even if we are able to physically go to the moon, we won't perceive the moon. So, one example to illustrate this point of how qualification or adhikar, as the word is used in Sanskrit, matters. Suppose somebody is working on a mainframe computer. It has incredible processing power, phenomenal amounts of memory, and different people are at different terminals on that mainframe computer. And different people working on that computer will have different levels of access. So somebody who's a data entry operator, they may have access only to one small drive or one set of files within that. Somebody who is a manager, they may have a slightly higher access. Somebody who is the CEO, they may have full access. Why the difference? It's the same computer, and they all may say that we are working on the same computer. But somebody who is, say, a data entry operator, not only will they not be able to access certain files, certain files, this, you can see the folder, you can see the file, but say you don't have the permission to access it. But in some cases, it may be that those files are hidden from their view itself. So when they're hidden from the view itself, what it means is that they can't be seen at all. Their existence itself is not perceived. So why is that? That's because they don't have that qualification. So similarly, when the Bhagavatam describes certain cosmology, it is, Parikshit Maharaj is asking Shukdev Goswami. Now, Parikshit Maharaj is not asking Shukdev Goswami to simply elaborate what he can see with his eyes. He wants to see a higher vision. Ultimately, he wants to see Krishna. He wants to remember Krishna. And if you see the Bhagavatam's cosmology in the 5th canto, it's not so much about cosmographical specifics. It's more about how throughout the universe there is dharma and devotion. And therefore, Parikshit Maharaj, you also should practice dharma and devotion. So the whole idea is the study of what matters. And so the Bhagavatam's cosmology and modern cosmology, are they contradictory? No, they are from different scales of perception. Somebody may say, this is all just made up. This is just something which you thought up to actually conceal the point that this is all unscientific. But just to maintain your faith in all these things, you're saying that there is a higher level of perception and you need to expand your consciousness. But because it contradicts science, it all is false. Well, could be, but maybe it's not that simple. Why not? Because even within Vedic cosmology itself, there have been different cosmological sources of knowledge. So within Vedic cosmology, there is what is called as Puranic cosmology and there is Jyotisha cosmology. So Jyotisha cosmology, Puranic cosmology gives us perspective from a celestial or a divine perspective. It is a higher vision of the universe from a higher perspective. The Jyotisha cosmology gives us perspective from our level. And there are books like the Surya Siddhanta which give remarkably precise information about the cosmos far before modern science discovered it. So for example, if we consider the distance, the cosmic distances, say what modern science measurement talks about as the distance between the Earth and the Moon, we will see that here 252,710 miles versus 250,000 miles. It's remarkably similar. Similarly, Earth's diameter is 7840 miles compared with 7926 miles, which is again remarkably similar. So this now, many of the same scholars, if you know, if we study Indian astronomy, there is Aryabhatta, there is Bhaskaracharya, there are many other prominent astronomers. So they study the Jyotishi Shastras and they also knew about Puranic cosmology. But although they were aware of the differences between the two, and even in our own tradition, there were the great saintly commentators who use Jyotisha for astrological purposes, and they also studied Bhagavatam cosmology. They were aware that the two differ, but one of the characteristics of an expanded consciousness is comfort with contradiction. If you forget everything from this talk, because it's too technical, if you just remember this one point, that one of the characteristics of one of the key characteristics of an expanded consciousness is comfort with contradiction. Now I say, what do you mean? How can I be comfortable with contradiction? Well, yes, we can be comfortable with contradiction because we understand that humility is not just a religious or a physical idea, it also has to be an intellectual idea. That means, so humility in the religious domain means I believe that there is a God who is far more powerful than me. Humility in the physical domain means I may offer my prostrated obeisances. But humility in the intellectual domain means that reality is far more complicated, far more complex than what I know. So not only what I know, maybe what is more complex than what I can know. So yes, there can be different perspectives, and people who are wiser than me have seen those two perspectives and they have accepted. In modern physics, I'll conclude with this particular example for this point now, that in this comfort with contradiction is something which characterizes even you go into any branch of knowledge, if you go deep inside it, to function, you have to become comfortable with contradiction. Consider physics itself. If you go deep into physics, there are two prominent theories in physics. There's quantum physics and there is relativity. And the two are significantly different. Some people may say even they're violently contradictory. Their vision of matter itself is very different. Is it that in quantum physics holds that everything actually only when there is an observer then things fall into place. Now Einstein is undoubtedly one of the greatest brains of the last century, if not the greatest scientific brains. He couldn't digest the whole idea of quantum physics, and he said that I would like to believe that the moon continues to exist even if I'm not looking at it. You say, isn't that obvious? Obviously, the moon continues to exist. But actually, quantum physics is not, actually everything is simply waves, and when there's an observer, then things coagulate, collapse, things are perceived as things. Now, this is a extremely simplified, bare bones analysis of an extremely complicated problem. But the point I'm making here is that even within science, there are different perspectives and the theories which come from different perspectives. And which works? Well, both work. For certain domains of reality, quantum physics works. For certain domains of reality, relativity works. And how to bring the two of them together, science has struggled and has not made much headway in doing that. A scientist as great as Stephen Hawking said that man's quest, he put the inability to reconcile the two positively, and he said, I'm happy to announce that humanity's quest for knowledge will never end. So we'll never be able to reconcile these two. Steven Weinberg, another Nobel laureate scientist, said that we have made remarkable progress over the last several decades, but the more we come to know, the further we seem to go from the solution. So currently, how does science operate? It operates on pragmatism. Pragmatism means what works. So for certain domains of reality where quantum physics work, although quantum physics doesn't make any sense in terms of the way we empirically perceive the world, but it works incredibly well, and quantum physics is used extensively. Now we are moving toward quantum computing, which could be a significant leap in computing power and speed. So there are certain areas where relativity works, and where it works, that's what is used. So humility means to not claim that we need to get an exhaustive, reconciliatory understanding of every aspect of reality before we move forward. No, we are finite beings, and we want all the wisdom that we can get to make our life as meaningful and as joyful as possible, to do as much good as we can during our short lifetimes for ourselves and for the world around us. So if that is the purpose, then science and spirituality can both be invaluable resources for us. To if you want to reconcile the two, not philosophically, because that is extremely difficult, but pragmatically, in terms of how we function in our lives, we could say that science, primarily through technology, science can make things better. Science can give us faster phones, can give us faster planes. Science can make things better, and spirituality can make people better. Spirituality can help us understand what really matters in our lives and to focus on that and to grow thereby. Spirituality can help us increase our virtues, to improve our good habits, to free ourselves from whatever vices we have. Spirituality can empower us internally, science can empower us externally. And together, if we use both science and spirituality, then by making things better externally, by making ourselves better internally, we can contribute to making a better world. So I'll summarize what I spoke today. I spoke on reconciling science and scripture. I spoke primarily with three main points. First is we talked about the domain, three quadrants: scriptural knowledge, something which agrees, something which disagrees, and something which contradicts. So why might there be a contradiction, and why might there be a disagreement? That was our primary focus. So and why there is there something that transcends? So I talked about how science is a progressive body of knowledge, and that's why things which are right now may be considered uh, wrong in the future. Things which were considered right in the past are considered wrong now. So then we discussed about the domains of knowledge. That science is the study of matter, spirituality is the study of what matters. Study of matter means science focuses on certain primary properties. I showed the quote of Erwin Schrödinger that it focuses on measurable parameters of the observed universe and the mathematical correlations between them. But in that process, much that is vital for us is left aside. I talked about panometer, lavometer, or even tastometer. These taste, love, pain, these are very important experiences for us. Some of them we want, some of them we don't want. We don't want pain, we want love, we want taste. But these we can't quantify. So there is much that exists beyond the domain of science. So the laws of gravity can explain why a stroke went across the boundary, but it can't explain it completely. It's a correct but not a complete explanation. So that section which transcends science is the primary thrust of the spiritual texts like the Bhagavad Gita or the Srimad Bhagavatam. And then when there is a contradiction, how do we look at it? So I talk about contradiction can happen because there are different scales of perception. So one contradiction is because certain things are beyond the domain of science. There seems to be a contradiction, but it's not exactly a contradiction. It's just there are two different domains of reality being pursued. But even when there seems to be a contradiction, it could be because there are different scales of perception. So, uh, powder can seem gray to a naked eye, but it can be seen as white and brown particles under microscope. Similar, the universe to the scientific eye, the moon and the various objects can seem to be just empty space that is waiting to be conquered by human beings. But to a more expanded consciousness, it's seen differently. It's seen as permeated with life, which we can't see. Just like if we have a mainframe computer, we may not be able to see what's there in that computer if we don't have the required access. So that access depends on the level of our consciousness. And is this idea of higher consciousness and higher access just a way to explain away what is actually unscientific and invalid? No, because that same tradition also gave empirical knowledge that is comparable with science, what scientific knowledge, modern science has acquired, but it gave it before. So there were teachers in the past, great scholars who knew about these two different things, the Jyotisha Shastra and the Puranic cosmology, Jyotisha cosmology, and they were comfortable with contradiction. So humility in the intellectual domain means that maybe we don't know and maybe we can't know. So rather than focusing on trying to know exhaustively, we focus on what works effectively. And that's what physics adopts. So quantum physics and relativity are not so easily reconcilable. But even scientists are pragmatic. So we too can be pragmatic, and we use science as a resource for improving things in the outer world, and we use spirituality as a resource for improving things in the inner world. And by combining both, we all can contribute to making a better world. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. So, are there any questions or comments?
Yes, Prabhu. So I will ask questions, Prabhuji.
Yes, sure.
So the first question is from a student from HBTU Kanpur. How, where, and why did this seed of atheism build up so much just in recent age, almost 200 years ago, by the scientific community?
Mm-hmm. Okay. What was the last part about scientific community? Can you repeat the last sentence?
I'll repeat the question. How, where, and why did this seed of atheism build up so much just in the recent age, almost 200 years, by the scientific community?
Okay. So, how did atheism grow? And did it grow because of scientific community? Well, it's very difficult to know what is a causal relationship. There is causation and there is correlation. So, what is the difference between the two? It has been found that people with bigger hands have bigger vocabularies. Hey, that's strange. Whenever I speak this in the class, everybody starts looking at their hands. Well, you may say, what has people's hand size got to do with vocabulary? Well, what happens is people with bigger hands are older. People with smaller hands are, say, kids. So, an average kid's vocabulary and average adult's vocabulary is going to be definitely different. So, there is, yes, it's true that bigger hands and bigger vocabulary are go together, but it's not a causal relationship. It's simply a correlation. And there is something else which is causing both. So, similarly, yes, science has advanced in the last 2 centuries, and also religion and faith in God has gone down. So now, is the causal relationship? Has scientific advancement led to atheism? So that, or is it a correlation? That's what we need to carefully understand. So the science is itself a tool for acquiring knowledge. Like Arvind Schrodinger said that science cannot talk about God. It doesn't tell us anything about God. Now, when scientists like Galileo or Newton, they talked about a God. That was their personal, we could say, conclusion based on their scientific observation. In science, there is certain process, certain criteria for proving certain things, and by definition, that which is spiritual is beyond empirical validation. It is Adhokshaja is one of the names of the Supreme Lord. So the study of scientific knowledge or the study of the universe through science can lead many people to believe in God. It can also lead many people to disbelieve in God. Now, why? So science itself may or may not be the cause. Science is simply a tool for looking at the world in a particular way. Over the last few centuries, what has happened is that society has changed in extraordinary ways. There's been industrialization, there has been urbanization, there has been fragmentation of social structures like joint families, and therefore uh, religious traditions and spiritual wisdom was passed down through certain channels, and those channels got disrupted. In the West now, it's almost half of the children who grow up, they grow up in between one fourth to one half of children grow up in single parent families. So if there's only one parent, usually it's a mother, sometimes it's a single father, then just taking care of the child becomes a big thing. Teaching them religious values, it's very, very difficult. So along with that, what also happened, so basically one reason why atheism increased was the structures that that the systems and the structures that pass down spirituality and theism, they were disrupted. Another reason was that religious extremism or the consequences of extremism of any kind became very prominent. Sometimes the idea is that religion causes violence, and it is true that religion has caused violence. At the same time, if we consider the First World War, Second World War, they were not fought on religious grounds. They were fought on the ideological grounds or simply property and power. So, but what happened is that over the last few centuries, religious extremism has not only increased, but it has also gained increased visibility and influence because of technology. Because of technology, religious extremism has gained increased reach. Now, terrorists in some part of the Middle East can blow up things in America or wherever they want. And through social media, we get to know about all that. So very easily, and even before social media, through television. So what has happened? Because of this, in the public mind, religion is associated with extremism. Now, religion inspires many, many people to live more charitably, more compassionately, more responsibly. If say people, if people are religiously inclined, they stay committed to their, for example, their marriage vows, and there is quite strong connection between the two statistically has been found out. But so overall, religion inspires people to do good things. Religion, in the name of religion, people also do bad things, but the bad things get a lot more press. And that's why, because in the public eye, religion has been associated with extremism. So that has also led to the increase in atheism. Now, has science itself played a role in that? So I talked about the sociological changes. I talked about the changes in the religious landscape also. Another aspect is also that science itself, has it led to atheism? Well, science has been misused by atheists to foist their atheistic ideology on people. In today's world, most people think that if I want to be scientific, I can't believe in concepts like God or soul. Well, why not? There is nothing in science, there is no scientific theory that can explicitly disprove the existence of God or the existence of soul. They are not within the domain of scientific study. Now, the domain of scientific study can be expanded and maybe they will be included. But they're not within the domain of scientific study as science is defined by mainstream in the mainstream academy today. So there are a significant number of scientists, even Nobel laureates, and not just old-time Nobel laureates, even contemporary Nobel laureates who do believe in science. However, again, in the public perception, the idea has come that science is associated with atheism, or rather, not science science associated with atheism. That to be scientific, I need to be atheistic. If I'm believing in stuff like God, maybe I'm not being scientific. So that is the misconception that we need to counter. There are many scientists who believe in God, and sometimes they talk about their belief, but there are many atheists who talk about God, but in the negative terms, that God doesn't exist. And unfortunately, in today's world, this is the last factor I will conclude with for answering this question, that secularism was originally defined as impartiality toward religion. But secularism has now become not impartiality toward religion, but indifference toward religion. That means in today's world, if there is a Christian scientist or a Muslim scientist or a Hindu scientist, if they are talking in their classrooms, they cannot talk about their religious beliefs because you have to be secular. But on the other hand, an atheistic scientist can talk about atheism, and that is acceptable because apparently atheism is not considered to be a religion. But atheists can be as dogmatic and as intolerant towards religions as some of the most fundamentalist religions can be toward other atheists, can be towards other religions or toward atheists. So because of secularism, in the public eye, scientists often don't talk about their faith, whereas atheists talk about their faith. And if it's there are religious scientists and there are irreligious scientists. So irreligious scientists or non-religious scientists talk about their non-religion, non-belief, whereas religious scientists don't talk about their belief. So that's how we see that atheism has increased. If science is studied systematically and explained, then there is no reason why science should lead to atheism. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, Prabhu. Very nice. Okay. Another question is from students of IIT Hyderabad. We know that entropy is associated with every matter. Can it be associated with the expansion of universe too? Is there any spiritual angle associated with the entropy and universe expansion?
Okay. Mhm. I presume is there any association between the expansion of the universe and entropy? Well, we could look at this from a perspective, and we could look at also from a perspective of, say, spirituality. So the idea of entropy can be used to, in general, talk about the point that there is no way a self-organizing universe could sustain itself forever. In general, the idea is that things degenerate over time. So if there is a certain amount of order in a universe, in any particular system, that order will go down. Now, for that order to be maintained or for that order to be improved, How does that happen? So the idea of entropy is sometimes associated with the idea of some kind of cosmic design, because things, they degenerate over time, and if they're degenerating, then they, if naturally things move toward degeneration, then for them to have been in a state where they were not degenerated, where they had a high level of integrity and energy and functionality, how did that come about? So it is sometimes used as an argument to point toward some higher intelligence or higher aspects within the observed physical universe. Now, the expansion of the universe is something which uh, is accepted by mainstream science today. And the idea is, we have seen distant objects moving further away from us, and we have seen certain other things like that. So there is also the cosmic background echo. So the expansion of the universe itself is not something which is which has intrinsically any spiritual implications, that within the spiritual or the scriptural conception of the universe, there is expansion, there is contraction, there is expansion, there is contraction. So I would say that whether entropy points to a higher intelligence, or whether entropy is associated with the expansion of the universe or not, these are issues that scientists can debate, theorize, and come to their conclusions. They don't have any direct spiritual implications. Either way, they can be used to point to the, so the idea of entropy can be used to point toward a higher existence, and whether the universe is expanding or not, that could be both the expansion of the universe and its non-expansion, or even its contradiction, can be accommodated within the scriptural worldview. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Prabhu. Prabhuji, the next question is from the students of IISc Bangalore. The question is that uh, how does the soul come in the mother's womb? In the scriptures, it is written that the father's semen and it comes through grains. Is there any scientific understanding for the same, which matches the scriptures?
Okay. So how does the soul come into the, say, the mother's womb in the embryo? In general, when scriptures describe any material phenomena, usually that description is indicative. It is not always exhaustive. What do I mean by indicative versus exhaustive? Indicative means this is one way it can happen. It is not that this is the only way it happens. So when it is said in the Upanishads that it is through in the Bhagavatam also it is said mm, that through the man's semen the soul comes into the mother's womb. Yes, that is one possible trajectory. Is that the only trajectory? Well, there is no reason for the soul to be limited that way. There is, just like I earlier talked about, the the skill of, say, of Virat Kohli in hitting a sixer, and the laws of physics, laws of motion, both can be complementary explanations for why the ball went across the boundary. So similarly, the physical and the spiritual explanations for the origin of, not the origin of life, you could say origin for the conception and procreation, can exist together. So there is, at a biological level, certain things happen. Biological level, the sperm enters into through the into the mother's womb, and then to be mother's womb, and then there is a union, there is a zygote that is formed. So now, if we look at it from a biological perspective, we see that even the semen that is there, it contains many sperms. So if we look at from biological perspective further, you know, which of those sperms actually reach the destination? It's a perilous journey, and many of them don't make it to the destination. Even after they make it to the destination, after that, whether how many survive and how much moves forward. So even among when there are twins, so twins can be either identical or non-identical, monozygotic or bizygotic or polyzygotic. So what happens is that means one zygote is formed and then it splits into two, or sometimes two zygotes are formed. That means, say, one sperm unites with an egg and then it splits into two. And there are two twins, or there are two sperm that unite with two zygotes and then they grow. So now what does this mean? Even if we consider there's one sperm, does one sperm have to contain only one soul? There could be some sperms that don't contain any souls at all. There could be some sperms that contain more than one soul. And then they unite and those two souls occupy those two bodies. So those two bodies in the case of monozygotic twins. And so there are lots of factors and lots of subtleties involved. So if we consider that it is also said that when a man and a woman unite, the consciousness determines the kind of child that will be born. Now, if that is the case, then what does it mean? That there are so many sperms entering into the womb. So then, is it that only the sperm that has the consciousness which matches both the consciousness of the mother and father, that sperm impregnates? And other consciousness, other sperms do not impregnate, they do not form a zygote. There could be many sperms that enter. That only one this particular sperm survives and others don't survive. So these are all complicated questions. And in general, when we talk about the interface between the spiritual and the material, it's more important to focus on the principles than on the mechanisms. Why? Because the spiritual domain itself is subtle. And so how the subtle interacts with the gross, that itself again becomes subtle. There is certain gross effects that we can see, but the mechanism by which those gross effects come about, that is sometimes very complicated. So here, what are we looking at? Just like now, to give another example of this subtle and gross interaction, the complexity of their interactions. So currently, the world is facing a pandemic. Viruses, actually, they are a good example of the complexity. Is a virus living or non-living? No, it's like this. Wherever there is life, there is soul. But viruses on themselves don't exhibit any life. But when they have a host, then they start exhibiting life. That means the soul needs a biological medium for functioning, and the soul doesn't have a biological medium, suitable biological medium. It can't function at the physical level. Once the soul acquires a biological medium, it starts functioning. So now, currently, when scientists study, okay, is this pandemic, if somebody has been infected, are they likely to get infected once again by corona? Even if they are not likely to get infected, can a person who has been infected and who has recovered, will that person be a passive carrier? Or has the corona count gone down so much that that person will will then not be infected again, or will not pass it on to others? These are all questions which we are still grappling. We don't have answers. So when the subtle interacts with the gross, not only the subtle itself difficult to understand, the subtle interaction with the gross is also difficult to understand. The broad principle is that the soul interacts with the gross, but if we consider the complexity of the interactions, that means that it's not just that those pathways alone are there, that there are there are various other kinds of there are various nuances going on over there, and we can't really control we can't can't control that interaction sufficiently to know it specifically. That this is the only way, or these are the only ways things happen. The subtle can interact with the gross in many different ways. Just as the soul can leave the body in many different ways at death. Normally, it is said if a person is in elevated consciousness, then the soul will leave through one of the upper holes. That means through the eyes, through the ears, through the nose, the nostrils. If the soul is not in elevated consciousness, the soul will depart from the one of the lower holes, the two excretory organs, and it will go towards a lower region. Now, this is the broad trajectory. But is this absolute? The soul can even break through the skull and go out if it's required. So there are certain indicative trajectories that are given, but these are not exhaustive. Does it answer your question?
Yes, Prabhuji. Next question is from Shubham Prabhu. Prabhuji, you talked about there are two types of fear which has added in the 21st century: fear of terrorism and fear of rejection. But if we see things in the history, there were much bigger fights and killing that happened before. So how do we understand that those fights were different from terrorism that you're connecting to now?
Okay, that's because generally in the past, even when there fights, civilians were not targeted. This was definitely not in India. When Megasthenes and others came after Alexander, they found one aspect of warfare in India was civilians, farmers would go on doing their farming while soldiers were passing by, and wars would take place. So, in general, civilians would not be targeted. And even if civilians were targeted, it was occasional for maybe looting them. At least that was the broad. There's a code of honor in the past, even among warriors. So now, if you consider, at least if you consider Mahabharata, the code of honor was that you should fight with equals who are equipped and alert. Equals who are equipped and alert. But terrorists do exactly the opposite. They attack, they're combatants who attack civilians who have no weapons and who are just going about their normal life. So the amount of fear caused by terrorism is far greater than the amount of fear caused by wars, because of the heavy level of unpredictability and brutality that is associated with it. Any other questions?
Yes, Prabhu. Prabhuji, this question has come from GGD students from Giri Govardhan Voice. Are aliens real or fiction? Is there any scientific
Okay.
proof?
Okay, so are aliens real or fictional? I would say I'd answer this in three broad parts. First is the existence of aliens. Second is the possibility of perceiving aliens. And third is the validity of the current claims of perception. Three distinct things. Now, firstly, the word aliens itself is a modern term, and often people have the idea of some green beings with some eyes popping up or something like that. But if we consider that, broadly speaking, is there life outside the earth, beyond the earth? The Vedic scriptures, they definitely say yes, there is life in various parts of the universe. And Srila Prabhupada would give a simple argument sometimes that if we look on the earth, if even in your house there's a small crack in the wall, sometimes you see ants coming out of there. So this earth is teeming with life. So why would God waste so much space that there's so much universe and nothing in it? So what science can honestly say at this stage? By honestly, I don't imply that science is being dishonest if it doesn't say this. All that I'm implying is that there are certain claims that are valid based on what we know, and there are others that are extrapolations. All that science can tell us is that life as we know it has not been found on the universe as far as we have observed it. Science always gives us very qualified knowledge. Life as we know it means what? That we don't really when we are looking for life, even if say we go to the moon, what do we look for? Have we combed every single inch of the moon? No, we look for certain indicators. Say we look for the temperature, whether it is suitable, look for water, we look for oxygen. But are these the sole preconditions, or are these essential preconditions for life to be possible? There are beings called extremophiles which live in extreme conditions. So deep inside the deep below the ocean, in the ocean beds, have been found certain beings which actually breathe in nitrogen dioxide. How can they even live like that? They live. They never see the sun, and still they live on. So all that we can say through science is that life as we know it does not has not been found in the universe as far as we observe it. From the spiritual perspective, the soul itself is indestructible. Soul is not affected by, soul itself is not destroyed or damaged by any material condition. So if the soul is given an appropriate body, then it can live in any material condition. So we could say that in different parts of the universe, it's possible that souls may be existing in bodies, in bodily forms that we are not aware of. So that's the first part. So in that sense, instead of aliens, does life exist on other planets? Yes, the Vedic scriptures do say yes. Now, now can that life be perceived? Well, it depends. If we look at the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, if we consider this is the terrestrial level, then above us is the celestial level where the godly beings stay, and below us is the subterranean level where the ungodly beings stay, and of course beyond it all is the transcendental level. So generally, when beings from the celestial or the subterranean level come, it's not that we can immediately perceive them. Say for example, when the sacrifices would be performed to appease the gods, so only if the gods would be very pleased would they come and make themselves visible to the earthly beings who are offering them sacrifices. Otherwise, just by the smooth, uninterrupted performance of the sacrifice, they would infer that the gods are pleased. So it's not that even if the gods came to us, the godly beings, if they came to us, we would be able to perceive them. And the same can apply to demoniac beings also, who can also make themselves invisible to human perception. So is it possible for us to perceive? Well, maybe, maybe not. It depends on various factors, including the will of other beings and our level of consciousness also. So now thirdly, as far as what has been perceived, well, alien sightings have been, you can classify them into some categories. There are claimed perceptions of flying objects that exhibit behavior not normally seen in human airplanes. Then there are claims of alien abductions. Then there are, basically these are two of the most hyped claims. Or now alien abductions, many alien abductions have been strongly debunked. Not all, but many. There are some Ivy League professors also who studied this field, and they began as skeptics. But over the period of time, as they studied, they found that more and more thoughtful people. So the idea of alien abductions are some aliens come and say somebody's just going in a car and suddenly their car suddenly stops for no reason and then somebody comes and takes them. And the idea of aliens abducting has also been romanticized in Bollywood. And then there are various kinds of strange beings that come because of the union between humans and aliens. So it has gone to the domain of widely popularized science fiction. but not just necessarily flying saucers, but flying bodies that seem to defy the laws of gravity as we know them. There have been a significant number that have been cited, and many security agencies also, the American Defense and others, they have cited them. One of ISKCON's leaders, Devamrit Swami, has written a book called Searching for Vedic India. There he gives a good amount of evidence for aliens. And Sadaput Prabhu is Dr. Richard L. Thompson. He was also a prominent ISKCON scientist. And he's written a book called Alien Identities, where also he talks significantly about uh, parallels between the description of the movements of these unidentified flying objects and the description of certain flying objects in the Mahabharata. Say, for example, there was a demon Shalva who attacked Dwarka, and he had a flying airplane, and its movements and the description of movements of UFOs and UFO sightings, there are significant similarities between the two. So we can say that some alien sightings uh, could be true, and rather than debating whether particular sightings are true or not, we can look at the bigger issue and recognize that the broad Vedic worldview does give a lot of room for aliens to exist and occasionally to interact with us also. Does it answer your question?
Yes, Prabhu. So should we take one more question, Prabhuji? One last one for today, or is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
One last question should be fine.
The one last question for today. It is also on a similar lines. This question is from Amit Kumar Yadav from Triple M UT Kanpur. He's asking, Hare Krishna Prabhuji, my question is, does ghost really exist? If yes, are there any type of ghost? And do they interact with human or harm them or control them?
Okay, do ghosts exist? Well, I have a website called Spiritual Scientist, where if you go to search for ghosts, you will find a whole article on that. And I also have a full class on this topic. I'll just quickly share a PowerPoint to explain the idea of ghosts. So if you see here, three levels of being, as you know, there's the soul and the subtle body, and there's a gross body. This is the way normally we live. Now, what happens in the case of death? Death is the soul along with the subtle body leave, and normally after this, the soul and subtle body go to a next body. Sometimes, because of various reasons, the soul may not get a next body. So when the soul doesn't get a next body, that's what is called as a ghost. So basically, it is disembodied soul. And sometimes this ghost can enter into some other body. This is called as possession. So possession means there is an original person was there, but that person has become idle. Some person entered into that body and taken control of that body. So there's possessed person and the possessing person, possessing ghost. So now, do ghosts exist from the Vedic perspective? Yes, embodied souls are ghosts. From the contemporary research, and there has been a significant amount of research that has been done. Alfred Wallace was a prominent scientist who worked as Richard Dawkins, as Charles Darwin, and he also is a co-founder of the theory of evolution, and he did a lot of other research. So one of his areas of study was in supernatural beings, and he said that I don't ask my readers for belief. All that I ask them for is doubt in the infallibility of their current understandings, of your current understandings. So he brings about a significant amount of research. So if ghosts exist, how do we really prove their existence? So as I said, science focuses on mathematical measurable parameters, and it's difficult to mathematically measure the effects of subtle beings. So broadly speaking, ghosts can interact with humans in three ways. It's called as apparition, communication, and possession. So apparition means some people just see a form. So maybe somebody, some loved one has passed away, and then they see suddenly their form appearing there, being there for some time, and maybe communicating with them and going away. But just generally when you see something, it's called apparition. Then communication is where they tell something. So communication can happen that ghostly being must tell something, or there are something called like planchettes, where there are mediums who communicate with deceased spirits, and through them certain information comes to people. And third is possession. So now among these apparitions, they are very difficult to scientifically establish because a person has them. If you see a large number of people also had a particular vision of a particular person who had died, we could always dismiss it as like a mass hallucination. That's what the skeptical approach would be. But with respect to communication, we could look at the verifiability of the information, the possibility whether that information could have been got by other means or not. And there's a devotee scientist, UTKARSH Prabhu, Dr. Michael Cremo. He's written a book called Human Devolution, where he analyzes various cases of possessions, and he does show that of communication and possessions. And so he does, when communication happens, there are many cases where there's just no reasonable way where that person could have got that information, which the medium, through the medium it was conveyed through a via planchette. And with respect to possessions, modern psychology sometimes call them as split personality disorders. Now, are all split personality disorders because of possession? No. Do all possession necessarily lead to split personality disorders? These are very complicated things. But the point is that the same person doesn't just behave in different ways. That's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was Robert Louis Stevenson's fiction. But there is a case of a woman in Nagpur. She lived in a small village near Nagpur. And once she was bitten by a snake, and this was well documented in scientific research, if you read Human Evolution. She was bitten by a snake, and suddenly she started speaking Bengali. And started speaking in a very different voice. Now, nobody in that village was from Bengal. She had never been to Bengal. She had never learned a word of Bengali. And suddenly she's speaking fluent Bengali. So where did she get that from? So we could infer that there was some kind of possession, but that's an inference. Now, in some cases it may be true, some cases it may be personality disorder, some cases it might just be people pretending to for some ulterior motives. We don't know. So again, in principle, ghosts do exist. In practice, is it that every person who feels haunted or who acts in strange ways is actually haunted? We need to be a little skeptical about the actual cases and observe them very carefully before we arrive at any particular conclusion. Okay. So thank you very much. Shall we stop here, Panchago Prabhu?
Yes, thank you so much, Prabhuji. Yes, Dhruv, thank you so much for your time. So, dear students, you saw how beautifully Prabhuji could answer so many scientific questions with a spiritual perspective. Here, I have put on the chat box two of his websites, thespiritualscientist.com and geetadaily.com. And the bit.ly site is a shortened site for his books, which is available on Amazon. And tomorrow also, we will be having question answers, which all of you can kindly put on this portal, which I have put on this chat box. So this is the same portal which you use for all the question answers. Please put your questions which Prabhuji will answer tomorrow based on scientific understandings. Thank you so much, students. Thank you very much, Chaitanya and Prabhu. We will seek for your association tomorrow also, and for next week, Saturday also, at 2:30 to 4 p.m. Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna. Thank you very much. Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna.